The night that followed was not one of struggle but of silence. In the room Ryu, now dressed, cut off from the world, and standing over the dead body, felt a surprising calm that many nights ago he had felt on the rooftop above the plague. After the attack on the gates, already at the time when he had been thinking about the silence that rose from the beds where he had left men to die. It was always the same pause, the same solemn interval that lulled the following a battle. It was a silence of defeat. But in the case, the silence that enfolded his friend was so compact and so harmonious, that so closely that the silence of the streets and town liberated from the plague, that Ryu really felt that this time it was a defiant defeat, and one that ends in war and makes a peace itself the irremediable suffering. The doctor did not know whether True, in the end, had found peace, but in the moment, at least, he thought that he knew that there would no longer be any peace possible for himself, any more than there would be the armistice and the mother torn from her son, or the man who buries his friend. Outside, it was the same cold night, the still frozen stars, the clear icy sky. The half-darkness of the room, one could feel the cold weighing on the window panes and the great pale breath of the polar nights. Near the bed, Miyamaru was sitting in a usual attitude, to the right side lit by the bedside lamp. In the center of the room, far from the light, Ryu was waiting in his chair that remembered his wife, but pushed the thought away each time it came. Early in the night, the heels of the piers by, and the sounds cleared in the chilling darkness. "Have you taken care of everything?" asked Miyamaru. "Yes," he phoned. Then they resumed their silent watch. From time to time, Miyamaru looked at her son, and he incorporated one of the looks. He smiled at her. The familiar sound of the night continued in the streets. Although they were not yet authorized to do so, a lot of cars were driving around again. They quickly struck the roadways, disappeared, and later reappeared, and were voices shouting, returning silence, and the horse hoofs, two trams screeching, and Ben's vague noises, and once more the breathing of the night. "Bernard?" "Yes." "You're not tired?" "No." He knew that his mother was thinking that she loved him at that moment, but he also knew that there was not much to love a person, or at least that a love is never strong enough to find its own expiration. So his mother and he would always love one another in silence, and that she would die in her own turn, and he would, without either of them at any time of their lives being able to go farther in confessing their affection. In the same way he had lived beside Teru, who had died that afternoon without being able to have the time readily to experience their friendship. Teru had lost the game, he said, but what he had Ryu won. All that he had gained was to know that the plague and to remember it, and have known friendship and remember it, and it to have known the affection and that have one day remembered it. All the men could win the game of the plague in life in the knowledge of the memory. Perhaps that was what Teru called winning the game. Once again the cars passed and Miyamaru stifled the little chair. Ryu smiled at her. She told him that she was not tired, and immediately afterwards, "You must go and rest over there, in the mountains." "Of course, mother." Yes, he would rest over there. Why not? That too was to be pretext for memory, but that it was meant to win the game. How hard it must be to live only with one who knows what one remembers and deprivate from what one hopes. This is no doubt how Teru had lived, and he was aware of the sterility of life without illusion, and there was no peace without hope. And Teru, who denies man the right to condemn anyone, yet who knew that no one could prevent him from condemning the even victims, the sometimes desperate tears. Teru had lived in a state of turmoil and contradictions, and he had never known hope. Is this why he lounged from the sainthood and the sought peace in the service of men? In truth, Ryu did not know, and it was hardly important. The only image that he would keep were those of the men who had taken the wheels of his car in both hands and driven those of his thick body now lying motionless. A warmth of life that had image of death, and that was knowledge. This, no doubt, is why Ryu felt calm the next morning he received the news of the death of his wife. He was now in his consulting room. His mother had arrived almost in a run to bring him the telegram, then went back to give the tip to the messenger boy. When she returned, her son was holding the telegram open in his hands. She looked at him, but his presence was staring out the window at the magnificent new day rising over the port. Bernard, said Madame Ryu. The doctor looked at her absent-mindedly. The telegram? She asked. That's right, he acknowledged. A week ago. Madame Ryu towards the window. The doctor said nothing. Then he told his mother not to cry, and that he had been expecting it, but it was hard. And yet, even as he said this, he knew that there was no surprise in his suffering. For months, for the last 2 days, it was a continuation of the same pain. The gates of the town finally opened at dawn in the fine February morning, the event that hailed by the people, the newspapers, and the radio, and the communities from the prefecture. It remains for the narrator to become the chronicler, and the hours, the happiness that followed the opening of the gates, and that even though he was among those who were not free to join the wholeheartedly. Great celebrations were organized from the daytime for the night, and at the same time the trains began to let off steam in the stations, while the ships from distant seas were already heading for our ports, making in their own ways that this day was the great reunion for those who had been separated. One may early imagine that what would become the feelings of the separation the inhabitants, so many of the townspeople. The trains that came into the town during the day were no less laden than those which left. Everyone had reserved their place the day during the 2 weeks of the suspension, fearing that the decision of the authorities might be annulled at the last moment. Some of the travelers coming into the town were not entirely relieved by the misgivings, because although they knew broadly the fate of those that were closest to them, they knew nothing of the rest of the town itself, which they imagined would look quite fearsome. But this was only true for those who had not been burning with passion throughout the period of time. The passionate were taken up by the ideal peaks, only to be things that had changed for them. The time which, during the months of the exile, they would have liked to push forward, so that it would go faster, and that which they would determine the speed up. Even when they were already at the side of the town, as soon as the train began to break before stopping, they wanted, on the contrary, to slow time down and hold it in suspension. The feeling at once vague and acute in them, all those months of the life lost in their love, made them some confused way to demand the sort of compensation through which time and joy would have passed at only life half of the speed of time waiting. And those who had experienced them in the room of the platform, like Rambert, whose wife had been informed weeks in advance, had done whatever she could to get here, were at the same state of impatience and turmoil, because Rambert was waiting in fear of the trembling of the confronts of the love and affection in the months of the plague, had reduced to the abstraction of the confront with the flesh and blood being who had been his support through that time. He would like to have again become the man who, at the start of this epidemic, wanted to leap into the single bound of the town, rush to meet the one he loved. But he knew that that was not possible. He had changed. The plague had introduced into him the detachment that he tired with all the strength to deny, and which none the less endured him like a dull pain. In a sense, he had the feeling that it ended too. Suddenly, He did not himself have such composure. Happiness arrived at full speed, even undertook exceptions. Rambert realized that everything had been given back to him in a single moment, and that joy is a searing emotion that cannot be surveyed. Moreover, everyone was, more or less consequently, like him, and that we must speak of everyone. On the stage and platform where they were resuming their personal lives, they still felt the sense of community that they exchanged looks and smiles between themselves. But as soon as they saw the train smoke, and the feeling of exile was suddenly extinguished, breaths of downpouring confusion and bewildered joy. When the train stopped, interminable separations, and that they started the same station platform, ended here in a second, in the moment when the arms closed with excludent greed around the bodies, those living forms they had forgotten. Rambert, for his part, did not have the same time to look at the shape running towards him until it was already crashing against his chest. He held her in both arms, pressing her head to him, seeing only the familiar hair, and letting his tears flow without knowing if they came from his present happiness or from a pain too long repressed, but sure at least that they would prevent him from verifying if this face buried into his hollow of his shoulder was the one which he had long dreamed, or rather that of a stranger. Later he would find out that his subconscious was true. For the time being he wanted to do what all those around him were doing, apparently believing that the plague had come and go without the hearts of men being changed. Pressed once again, they all returned home, blind to the rest of the world, apparently triumphing over the plague, forgetful of misery and of those that had also arrived at the same train, but also had found no one was preparing in their homes to have confirmation of fears already born in their hearts out of the long silence. For some of them, they once who were now on their only that branded the sorrow of compensation, and for others there was a moment of contemplating the memory of the lost and loved ones, thinking of the very different the feeling of separation had reached its peak. For such people, mothers, husbands, wives, lovers, who had lost all happiness with the beings of whom were now buried in some anonymous pit or dissolved into piles of ashes, and the plague was still there. But the thoughts of those lonely people at noon the sun triumphed over the cold winds, and now staggering the air silent morning, and bathed the town in uninterrupted waves of tranquil light. The daylight hung in the air, and the fronts of the hill cannon sounded ceaselessly beneath the still sky. The whole town rushed outside to celebrate the crowded minutes when the time of ciphering and the end of the time was forgetting had not yet begun. They were dancing in every square. The traffic had increased considerably from one day to the next in the car, from which there were now many more, and the difficulty driving along the packed streets. The bell of the town pealed continually throughout the afternoon, filling the blue and gold sky with the vibrations the churches that were still holding the services and thanksgiving. At the same time, places of pleasure were filled with bursting. The cafes were handing out the last supplies to the spirits, with no thoughts of the future. In front of the concierge, the crowded and equally excited people hustled and bustled among the several couples, hugging and kissing, not bothering about appearances. Everyone was shouting and laughing. That day they expected the stock of life, and they had piled up during the months that they had put their souls in the back burners, and like the days were still survival. The next day life prospered and resumed the resistance of restrictions, and for the time being people were very different organs, and the fertilizing elbow to the elbow. And equally the patience of death had not achieved what realized by the joy of deliverance, at least for the few hours. But the commonplace exuberated was not the whole story. Those who had filled the streets with the end of the afternoon, besides Rambert, often consoled more delicate joys beyond the attitude of calm. Many couples and families seemed to like nothing more than the peaceful strollers. In the reality, more were making quiet pilgrimage in the places that had suffered and it meant showing the new arrivals the obvious and hidden signs of the plague, the vestiges of its history. In a few cases, they were consequent to the plague guides, and the person who had seen lots of things and lived with the plague, had they spoken to the danger without mentioning fear. These were the harmless pleasures, but in other cases the entreaties were the more highly changed. When the lovers, given way to the sweet pains of memory, could say that he loved once, "Here is such a time I wanted you, and you were not here." You could not recognize the passionate tourists. They had formed the aisles of the whispers and conferences in the midst of the bustling crowds of them. And it was they who, better than the brands of the street corners, announced that the true deliverance, because these enchanted couples, locked together, sparing the world, and the proclaimed in the midst of the throngs that the triumph and the injustice of the unhappiness and the plague and over the terror of the had its day. Against all evidence, they calmly denied that we had ever known this senseless world in which the murder of a man and the happening of the biennial of the death and the flying of the well-defined serenity and calculated delirium and the imprisonment that brought with the terrible freedom and everything that was not the immediate present, and the stench of death and the son of all those who did not kill him. In short, they denied that we had been that boredom people whom some every day suffered into the months of the oven, and evaporated in oily smoke, whilst the rest weighed down by the chains of the impotient fear and waited their turn. At least that is what struck Dr. Ryu, who, making his way to the outskirts of town, was journeying alone in the midst of the ringing bells, fire and cannons, music, deafening shouts. Work went on, and there is no holiday for the sick. In the lovely soft light of the bathed Orion, you could smell the old smells and the grilled meat and the absinthe-flavored aperitifs. Around him, laughing faces were raised towards the sky. Men and women clung to one another, and their faces lit with excitement and the cries of desire. Yes, the plague was over. So was the terror. These arms enlaced one another, said that they had been exiled in separation in the deepest sense of the word. For the first time, Ryu could give the name to the similarities for the months that he had on faces of people pressing in the streets. Now it was enough to look around him. Now the plague was over, with the mystery of the preservation, and all these men were eventually taken on the clothing and the roles they had been playing for a long time, that of the emerges, whose faces then the clothes now spoke in the absence of the distant homelands, and for a moment the plague closed in the gates of the town. They had started their live with the state of the separation that had been cut off from the humans, warmth that leads in the forgotten everything. To a different extent, every corner of the town, these men and women had aspired the reunion that had not the same kind of each of them, which, for all of them, the equally impossible. More than it appealed to strengthen the absent ones, the warmth of the body and the tenderness of the familiarity. A few, often without knowing it, had suffered from being placed beyond the friendship of men and being able to reach them by the unusual means. Letters, trains, and boats. Others, who were rather still perhaps like Teru, had wanted to be joined with something that they could not define, but which appeared to them as the only desirable good, failing at any other name, sometimes called it peace. Ryu was still walking, but he went to the crowd and grouped around him. The din increase that seemed to him to be the outer districts he was trying to reach were moving further away. Bit by bit, he melted into the great bellowing bodies, understanding the cry better because, at least in some respects, it was his own. Yes, they all had suffered together in their flesh and in their souls. From the hard separation, the irremediable exile that never satisfied thirst. Amongst the heaps of the dead bodies, the ambulance sirens, and the warnings, that was known as the fate of the obstinate stamping of the fear and the terrible rebellion of their hearts. A great voice had continued to call on the terrible and horrifying people that had to return to the true homes. For all of them, their true home was beyond the walls of the suffocating town. This was the sweet-smelling bushwood, the hills to the sea, and the free countries in the heavy burden of love. And towards the happiness they had longed to go back, turning away from the disgust from everything else.